Welcome, church family and friends of Loma Linda University Church. Welcome to camp meeting and welcome to this live Q&A today with Pastor Randy Roberts and my good friend and new colleague, Adriana Pereira. Today, we're going to be discussing one of the key components of our church's mission and motto, which is discipleship, and that is worship. And so we're really excited to have that conversation with you. Now, before we get into that conversation, I'd love to share a few things with those of you who are watching, and that is, number one, we're thrilled that you're watching. It's been so exciting over these last 5 months to hear your comments, how thrilled you are about these conversations and how much it's been a blessing, kind of almost having a potluck meal and you're invited into the midst of it. I heard one couple saying, we have a few friends over and we put you on the end of the table and we're all eating lunch and talking amongst each other and listening in. And so absolutely love that. Today, I want to just encourage you, if you're watching from somewhere around the world, would you tell us where? And also tell us one thing that has surprised you, that you didn't expect would happen in your life over these past 5 months. So you can kind of almost learn from what other people are going through and realize, man, we're all in this together. No matter where you are in the world, no matter how old you are, what race you are, what gender you are, we all are going through so much and we're doing it together. So tell us a little bit about yourselves and where you're watching. Right now, I want to invite my good friends, both Pastor Randy and Adriana, to join me now.
Good to see you, Philip.
Hey, guys.
Good to see you, Adriana.
Hi, Philip. Hi, Randy. Good to be here.
Hey, awesome. I'm so glad that you two are on this, and especially glad, Randy, you're back from your vacation.
Thank you, sir. Is that what that was? It's good to be back with you. Very much.
You know, I feel like you really shouldn't do what you do. I heard you go on speaking engagements the entire time. I wonder, how is that a vacation?
No, you can't believe everything you hear, Philip.
Oh, man. Well, now you couldn't go anywhere because you had to stay home. So I heard you had some honey-do lists to finish.
We got a lot done at home. We're still working, but we got a lot done and we're delighted. So
that's
good
awesome
to be back, though.
And Adriana, how have you adjusted to this new climate, hot California?
I just can't have enough. I love it. You know, it really feels like Spain when we live with my husband for 20 years or so. So we're just so happy to be here, and we explore beaches around, which are a lot, and we are so happy. So thrilled to be here.
Great.
What's your favorite beach so far?
Laguna Beach.
Oh,
yes.
So beautiful.
Yeah, it's a nice
I'll tell
place.
you a secret beach there in Laguna that my wife and I really enjoy. It's called Table Rock. If you've never been there, it's kind of got this cove and it's surrounded. It's very small, very nice. It's right near Laguna, right there down the PCH.
You know, Adriana, Philip used to be a pastor at the Laguna Niguel Church, so he was right down in that area.
That's
really?
right.
And then God called him to the heat of the Inland Empire.
Oh, boy. I'm grateful for everything that he called me to here, besides the heat and the lack of an ocean.
That's true.
Yeah. Well, hey, I'm so excited to talk to both of you about one of these key aspects of our church and in particular, worship. But before we do that, you know, it's camp meeting season. So we want to hear just a little story that both of you might have on what's a favorite memory that you have of a previous camp meeting experience, whether it was here, somewhere in the world, or as a child. I'd love to hear, and I know our viewers would, of any experience you might have had that would be interesting.
Wow. Adriana, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I was raised in Uruguay, and my parents, they live in different countries, so we have always followed them in no camp meetings in Uruguay or Brazil or Argentina. So the first time I experienced camp meeting was at Oakwood, Huntsville, Alabama. And I remember that Hispanics, they have their own camp meeting. So we brought Alejandro Bullon. I don't know if you're familiar with that name, but he's a big name. And I finally got to meet him there and do some translation for him. So that was just very big for me and the family. We just spent some time with him, and it's a person that I love and admire, deeply admire. So that was a good memory that I have.
That's excellent, Adriana. In fact, I was wondering when people started signing on and giving Sabbath greetings. The first one is somebody named Eduardo Bullon, and he's at the top of the list. And when I saw his name, I thought, I wonder if he's related to Alejandro Bullon. And I don't know if he is or not, but same last name. So,
Right.
Wow, Philip. Some of my least favorite memories of camp meeting were when I was a pastor in Texas, and when camp meeting came around, all the pastors had to head to the campground and set up the big tent. And it wasn't just that it was a lot of work. I mean, I've worked all my life, but it was that it was out in the middle of the Texas humid heat.
Oh,
It was just brutal.
oh
It
man.
was not one of my favorite memories of camp meeting. So that may be part of the reason why I love camp meeting at Loma Linda University Church so much, is we set up this big tent in our minds, and yet we get to enjoy the sanctuary. So
Oh man.
I have so many great memories of camp meeting over the years here at LLUC. I guess a couple of my favorite ones, and these aren't one moment, but many of them. One is the singing, the congregational singing that we do together, like Doug and his crew led us with this morning on the service. I have so many good memories of that. And then the times we get together socially at Drayson Center, out on the North Lawn, those kinds of communal events for camping. Those are great memories. I will always treasure those.
That's awesome.
What about you, Philip?
I have one where I think of when I was a little boy, and my dad was a pastor too, and we would go to Ohio camp meeting where he was pastoring, and we would be in the dorms at the Adventist academy that was there. I think it was called Mount Vernon Academy. And it was so fun, man. I got to play with all kinds of friends and meet new girls and play basketball, and
good times.
it was so fun. For 2 weeks, you would just enjoy. That's one thing I kind of miss, not having, this experience that you kind of go away to.
Yeah,
that was something.
That is true.
I really did enjoy that.
Although you brought something back to my mind, Philip, when we would go to this camp, it was called Nameless Valley Ranch. They would have all the pastors sleep in the cabins. And I remember my dad and I one year were in the cabin with this other pastor. And I mean, I've heard of snoring, but this was something of a whole different it sounded like a train was coming through our room.
Goodness.
And the next morning, everybody was saying, man, I couldn't sleep. It was awful. And this guy says, well, I slept fine. And he said, I woke up, there was nobody snoring. I said, that's because you woke up. So that was not one of my greatest memories, but still very interesting.
Oh my. I love that. I love that. Camp meeting is about that.
It is.
Well, more than snoring, but Hey, well, why don't we say hi to some of our viewers who are watching from around the country. If any of you see anyone in particular, I'll start here. I'm seeing Ella May watching from Show Low, Arizona.
Show Low. Beautiful.
That's a great name.
Good to have you, Ella May.
Victor from Dana Point. We
Beautiful.
got Rosalina from Santa Ana.
Look at this, Nathaniel Jackson from St. Lucia in the Caribbean. That's not even fair. I mean, how is there justice in the world when St. Lucia? In all seriousness, though, we're thinking and praying for people out in that direction with the hurricane season right now. So with Nathaniel and all of his family and friends, all the best.
Yeah. I love what he said here. Your program has been a blessing to my family over the past few months. May God continue to bless LUC and its staff.
Then we have Roxy Savora. I love to see you on our pastoral staff. Adriana, muchas bendiciones. Looking forward to seeing you in person after many years. So that's wonderful. This is someone apparently you've known over the years.
Yes, it's a good friend of mine, and she's a great singer, so she will be joining us soon.
Excellent. All right, Roxy, we're looking forward to having you sing for us.
Good. We got Shemaiah Mills. Hey, how are you, Shemaiah? Watching from Charlotte, North Carolina.
Beautiful. I hope they're not anywhere near the hurricane's pathway.
Oh, man. Rio Anderson, Shalom, New York.
Wow, I didn't know there was a place called Shalom. What a great name. I hope it lives up to its Hebrew meaning, Philip.
Amen to that one. Well, Rio has been a great viewer. He's been commenting all throughout, so appreciate you, Rio. Monica Klein, you're sending us a heart. We love you too.
Good, Monica. Monica is down where you used to pastor, Philip.
That's right. That's right. Hey, and one more here. We got Rajeshwari joining us from Houston, Texas. So glad that you're on. Darlene Dickinson from Camarillo. Marta from San Francisco. Edgar saying, hey, glad to have you back, Randy.
Thank you so much. There's several of you have said that. That warms my heart. Thank you so much. You know, Philip, we have to read what David Smith wrote.
Okay.
Did you see that?
I didn't.
I roomed with Pastor Royce Williams on the camp meeting trail. His snoring was deafening. And I complained one morning over breakfast. He was offended and said to me, well, just wake me up. I shook my head. How, Royce? I couldn't shout at you any louder than you were snoring. Well,
no.
Royce is going to be coming after you, David. So
that's awesome. I struggled with one of my roommates snoring, and I had to move rooms. It's hard. It's painful.
It is that.
I love the guy, but I couldn't do it. Well, why don't we jump into our questions here? And I know some of our viewers are wondering about how we even came up with these 5 and where exactly are we going with this. But we want to kind of start off with maybe a foundational question. What is discipleship itself, Adriana and Randy? And why do these 5 themes in particular emerge as most important for discipleship? And I would love to hear maybe kind of a historical perspective you have, Randy, on how they came about too.
Well, you know, years ago, our pastoral staff was on a retreat, and we were talking about what specific facet of our life with God, our journey with Jesus, we felt was most important to emphasize at Loma Linda University Church. And there was a strong sense of almost unanimity around this concept of discipleship. Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations. He called his own disciples. He surrounded himself by the 12. And through those 12 people, he changed the world. And so it's been years that we have had this as our focus. And really, I like to say the most simple way to think about it is that discipleship is a lifelong, life-changing journey with Jesus. That it means what happens as we apprentice ourselves to Jesus, as we become his learners, his students. But it's not just about cognitive information, it's about spiritual transformation. And it ultimately reaches out and touches all facets of our lives. So that's how I think of discipleship, and that's kind of how we begin to emphasize that at LUC.
Adriana, any thoughts on when you think about what exactly discipleship looks like from your experience or what you've seen?
Yeah, as Randy was talking, I remember that when he called me and he explained what was Loma Linda University Church about, I got emotional, and he was looking at me like, is she crying now? But as a disciple of Jesus myself, you know, I couldn't agree more with these words. And because I'm not only words, that's the very essence of the gospel. And that is what I want for my life. You know, I want anything that distracts me from Jesus, from his person, his message, you know, his gospel, his pure gospel. I don't want any distraction in my life. That's what I am. That's what I want to be. That's what I want for my family. That's what I
Mm,
want for my community. So when it comes to worship, in the Bible, the term, the many terms actually used for worship always refer to a posture of the heart, an
mm,
attitude, right? It's just coming into the presence of God. And all the rest kind of vanishes, right? It's just the presence of God. It's all that matters. And what I love about it is there's a certain intentionality in the worship practice in the Bible. So you make yourself available and intentionally seek for God's face. So that is what I understand our goal as people and as a community as well, right?
mm.
That's
Wow.
beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
You know,
Well,
Philip, if I could just add a word about, you asked about the 5 values or holy
yeah.
habits. I think of discipleship as affecting our whole experience.
Mm,
So up, down, in,
Mm.
out. So
mm.
we go up to God in worship. We delve down into the depths of his spirit through his word and through prayer.
Uh-huh.
We grow internally and are changed so that we have humble attitudes of service to the needs of others and obeying God by sharing his word with others. And then we reach out to those around us in community, and we become a part of a community of faith. And every one of those seem to be holy habits in which the disciples of Jesus and the early church engaged. And we've just come to believe that if we are consistently, with open, humble hearts before God, engaging in those holy habits, we will grow as disciples.
Mm, mm. So when you think about how these 5 emerged, it was this notion of recognizing the postures of a believer in different aspects, and
Correct.
felt like these 5 stood out as the pillars of that.
Right.
I see. I
Yeah.
see. Okay. Well, today you really talked about one of those aspects, and that being worship. Adriana kind of started us off already in discussing that. When you think of what is biblical worship, a lot of times people have various interpretations about what worship is, what does it look like. But when we want to start out at building a disciple, we want to tell them exactly as Jesus did, hey, teach them as I have commanded you. And so when we think then about biblical worship, what is it that Christ, both Old and New Testament, told us worship is? I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on that.
I'd love to hear Adriana to start with. I've heard her speak on these things before, and I've really appreciated it. So I'd love to hear her share.
It's interesting. Thank you for the difference. It is interesting that as a music teacher, I've been going to the Bible and trying to find answers and getting so frustrated because I want to know what would be the right way to worship
Mm,
with details. I'm thinking melodies, chord progressions, instruments, styles. That's what I'm thinking as a music teacher. And I think music is important as an expression of worship. So I want to know what is the right way, what is the right place. And then I find myself in the same place that the woman at the well. What is the right temple?
mm,
And Jesus says, it's Jerusalem, but you don't need a building. You need a savior.
mm.
I am who you need. I am hidden. And she tries to kind of, uh, I would say, direct or control the conversation. And I love Jesus' silence and total command on this is the point that I'm going to make. You have no idea who you are talking to. You are talking to God Himself that created a space and a time to reach out to you in this very moment. And that is worship. It's just we come to Him, but He already, created that space and the time for us. We are the ones coming in and out, but He is there always for us. So I love that in the Bible, God didn't give me the answers that I was looking for. but he taught me, and I think that's something that he does with us, to just to change our questions to something that is more close to his heart. So now maybe I don't understand exactly the instruments, the musical instruments he wants me to use, but I understand that he wants me to search his presence more than anything else, to, to be teachable by his spirit, and then the rest will fall into place. You know what I mean? It's a
Mhm.
matter of priorities. It's a matter of uh, what I'm really looking for. If I am looking for God to please my desires, or questions, or I am able to really listen to what his heart is trying to tell me. and
Mm.
and when you see that in the Bible, you see people jumping out of joy, some others in silence, some, in tears, some others just um, celebrating with different expressions of worship. And they are all in contact with this God. They all came into this presence, but the reaction is very different. Sometimes it's just very opposed one to the other. So I love that about my God. You can
Mm.
worship from who he made you to be. I think
Wow.
that's so beautiful.
Wow. Wow.
That is beautiful.
I think of, Rainy, maybe before you share anything, I think of one experience that I had as a young teenager, recognizing I grew up in a church that just didn't have a lot of musical talent. And so that church there in the Midwest, not that all Midwest churches are like this, okay? I'm just saying this
I'm
one
glad you
I was in
clarified.
at this time, it was a very small church. My dad had a district, and at this one particular church, they didn't have much, and so they just played music through videos, and there were all kinds of instruments in there. And I thought, my goodness, at one point I thought, that's so unfortunate they have to do that. And yet at the same time, I realized that this notion of worship isn't necessarily about the instrument, the sound always. It's about the heart's desire to connect with God. It's about us giving him praise and adoration. And I could look beyond this moment and say, they're doing their absolute best. And they're trying to connect with the Lord in this way that's just so meaningful, in spite of the fact they didn't have any musicians in the church. There was no one there. They would sing a lot of times in a cappella, which was amazing.
Mhm.
But that kind of hit me as a young boy. I realized, man, it's about me and the Lord and connecting, and what can be the best conduit for that in this season, depending on where you are in the world, depending upon the resources of the people as well.
Wow, very good. I think when I read Romans 12, 1 and 2, I am drawn back to the concept that our worship is our giving of ourselves to God fully and completely in every facet of who we are. That passage talks about our minds being transformed. It talks about worshiping God with our bodies as a living sacrifice, an ongoing offering to God. And it just strikes me that every facet of who we are is to be offered as a gift to God and to be used in our worship of God. Years ago, I was preaching, I don't remember why we were on Romans 12, but on that passage, and it struck me, and so I used it, that the best name to give to that is when ordinary life becomes worship. So it's just our everyday, our ordinary life, and we're just
Beautiful.
constantly bringing that in worship to God. Worship is far more than a service. It's a posture, it's an attitude of life.
Hmm.
I read someone just this week, I found in my sermon prep time, that talked about how he grew up in a home where, I guess, especially in the summers when he was out of school, he did a lot of manual labor. His family, I forget, had a farm or something like that. They would come in to eat lunch, and the mom would have, he and his dad and whoever else was working, the mom would have lunch ready, but she was also cooking on the stove a pot of stew for the evening. And she had been slicing and adding vegetables and I think they probably ate meat, some meat, and whatever else it was that she put in the stew. And he said, it smells so good. I was like, oh, good. Are we having that for lunch? She said, no, 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 don't touch that. And she wouldn't let him get near it. And I was like, why? It smells good. She said, it's not ready yet. It has to simmer. It has to stew on the stove. And he said, when we came in that evening, it was by then the aroma wafted through the whole house. And she would serve us these large bowls. We were ravenously hungry of this stew. And he said, my mom explained it by saying, all of the juices of every single element in the pot have to have a chance to marinate together, to weave themselves into each other. And that's when the aroma and the flavor really are experienced. And he said, to me, worship is like that. It's the people of God everywhere in their ordinary lives. They are marinating before God. And when we come all together, we bring everything we've experienced in that process to this moment, to this service. And that's what makes a worship service such a high point. But it is only a service. Our whole lives are worship before God. And what a privilege that is to worship God.
Hey, now both of you have been in this space of worship from a church standpoint, from a musical standpoint. Now, a lot of church members are going to be looking at the idea of worship from also a different perspective, and that being that they have preferences. You have preferences, I have preferences, ways in which I seem to connect with God better, that deals with a musical note within worship. Music,
so like different styles, you mean?
Yeah, different styles of worship. And so I guess the question I have for both of you is, how can a multiplicity of styles of worship in terms of music exist in a biblical community?
You know, I saw a bumper sticker back in Texas one time that said there's only two kinds of music, country and Western. And, you know, that's kind of the way that some people approach the theme that you're talking about, Philip, is that there's one style, it's my favorite style, and then they take one step further and say, and it's the only biblical style.
Yeah.
And then we end up in real wars over worship.
Yeah.
So I'm delighted to be able to refer that question to Adriana.
Yeah, it is interesting that scholars, they say that worship, it has two dimensions, right? The vertical and the horizontal. So connecting with God, but also when we are in community, we have to connect with each other through worship. And it is so easy for us to connect with God. You know, He makes it so affordable, so easy, 24/7. It's just thinking about Him, and He is already available, right? To you. But it's not the same with each other. You know, it's not the same. It's more difficult. So the horizontal dimension of worship is always more challenging because of our nature, I guess. But there's something about music and identity. You know, when you have been used to listening to certain music, that that plays an important role in the construction of your personality, who you are. You know, it has so many connections with your family, with your places, with your memories, with smells, and so many extra musical elements that play a role in that connection. So it's part of who you are. You don't realize how music is deeply ingrained in your identity. So when you go to church, you want to see familiarity, you want to connect, and that is, you know, that is a legitimate desire. We all have the right to expect that. However, we are in a diverse family, and today, I mean, worshiping in this century makes it more challenging than any other time in history, because generations, I mean, Apple says a generation right now, they last, I think, 2 or 3 years. and the a generation is different from another, and you can see that in their playlist. And I see that in my children. I had two children, and they are 15 months apart, and they have different uh, musicians and groups that they prefer. And it's like, how is that possible? So according to Apple, they belong to different generations because their playlists are different. That's so crazy. So it's almost impossible to keep up with this generation. When we go to church, as Randy was saying, so beautiful before, we have to kind of spit together and blend. And sometimes that is impossible because my music, I mean, for me, Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach, he is the truth. I mean, you can give me anything else, and I will say, yeah, that's all right. But you just give me Bach, and I just will say that it's the best taste in music for me. Nobody else will satisfy my soul as a composer as he does. But of course, I'm a music teacher, and I'm thinking chords and harmonic progression. So how is it that we can worship together if we have so many different walks in life and memories and preferences? Well, something that really helps me is to think that we have 6 days to listen to whatever we prefer, right? And God is always surprisingly okay with that. But when we come as a community, we have a few hours just to be a community and try to find common ground to worship together. So yes, we will have to sacrifice some things, but we will do that because we want to be together and we want to listen to each other. And when we want to discover together, what is it that we can sing together and we can listen to each other, and we can learn from each other. So yeah, the horizontal aspect of worship is always more challenging. It will be, and I don't think it will be easier until we get to heaven and find that common repertoire forever, right?
Yeah, that's such a good statement, Adriana, because it's so easy to become impatient with a brother or sister who worships in a different style or has a different taste. And I remember, let me tell a story rather than comment further along those lines. Some years ago, when we're going to do this again in our new building, but we had invited our young adult community contemporary service to come into our sanctuary, and became a vibrant community there. So we were having a church board meeting. We were working these things through. And one of the members of our church stood up. We were giving time for everybody to talk, anybody who wanted to say something. One of the members of our church stood up and said, "I hate that kind of music. I just can't stand that kind of music." And then went on and said one or two other things. And when the individual was done, I said, I really appreciate the way you handled that, because there's certain kinds of music I can't stand. Certain kinds of music I just flat out do not enjoy. But what you did not do, which I sincerely appreciate, is you did not take the next step that many people take. And that is the step of saying, I hate it, so God hates it too. And that means it's evil. This person never did that. They're a dear friend of mine, and I respect them. And I respected the way they handled that, because we need to be honest enough to say, hey, that's not my cup of tea.
Yeah.
But then we also need to be gracious enough to say, that may be the way that someone else is blessed by God and blesses God. And that's okay. It's not maybe the way I'll do it, but it's the way they do it. And I'm respectful of that.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important distinction to make. Somebody, I forget who it was, this was years ago, made the statement, you have created God in your own image when God hates all the same people you do. And I think that's true with worship styles as well. You know that you've recreated God's desire for worship when God only worships the way you do and he hates the way everybody else does it. That's a dangerous place to be.
I think of when my wife and I had some time to spend overseas. And while we were at this church community, some of the missionaries that were there really advocated that the locals not use a particular instrument in their worship service because they thought it was unbiblical, it wasn't holy, it was improper to use. And it felt almost sad to me to some extent, because they had taken what maybe is a very local instrument. It was a very local instrument that's used there regularly. They brought it into the church to bring about this contextualization of worship, but it was improper for these missionaries that were there, and they deemed it unbiblical and unholy. I don't know. What do you think about culture and its impact on worship preferences?
Let me just say a word to that, Philip, because if we happen to be students of history, especially Christian history and Christian worship history, we can learn a lot. There were some awful things said about the organ in church history, about the use of the organ in worship.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, things like it's just a bag of whistles and pipes, this the devil, and on and on. This is about the organ. When the piano came along, same thing. All kinds of reasons why the piano was used down in the bars. It was used in the silent movie theaters. Piano had no business being in church. Now, I'm old enough to remember when the guitar was a major source of resistance in battles. How could you bring a guitar into a worship service? And then in more recent years, it's had to do more commonly with drums. So each time this has happened, it's usually been resisted because it's new, it's different, it has too much association with some other context. And I think we need to be careful and humble enough to learn from the lessons of history. And this is an area where I know Adriana has spent a lot of time studying, and I'd be curious, Adriana, to hear what you might say about that.
I think the piano is the perfect instrument, and everybody should think the same.
Uh-oh.
I wonder what you would also add to the discussion, Adriana, with how there are these now kind of scientific studies being done with music and its influence to influence a person in certain ways, depending upon the rhythm and the beat and those kind of things too.
Yeah, it is interesting because, it was 3 or 4 months ago that I was in Andrews University, and it was Dr. Paul Hamel 100th birthday. And Paul Hamel, he wrote this book, Ellen G. White and Music, Principle and Background. And it's really a great book. I love that book. And in that book, he wrote, and this book was published in, I think it was 1972. And he wrote that we should avoid jazz and rock styles and hybrid musical styles in church. And he had a reason to say that in 1972, because as you know, rock and roll was more about, I would say, rebellion against some Christian principles, and it has an aesthetic that was very offensive to Christianity. Right? So that was the context in which he wrote this. And then when I interviewed him 3 or 4 months ago, I asked him, if you had to write that book again, would you write the same thing that you wrote about, for example, rock and jazz? And he told me, absolutely no, absolutely not.
Oh, wow.
It was interesting because in his birthday, there was a jazz band. And they were just playing some music to celebrate his birthday, and I was very surprised, because I remember what he thought about jazz, and then he told me absolutely no, and then he was telling me things have changed so much in 30 years, and I, as a musician, you have to constantly redefine lines and styles because music keeps evolving. So, what is the role in of culture in music evolution? That's a very interesting question, which force musicians, as much as you theologians do with theology, is the study of God. So you have to keep being teachable and just learn, right? It's a never-ending research, and music is the same. You have to
Mhm.
be able to redefine, to constantly trying to understand what is the scenario, how music impacts people and your congregation in particular. And in that regard, I would like to say that I'm so happy that we have a new area of study, which is psychoacoustics. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
I'll let Phil answer
Psychoacoustica.
that because, yeah.
You're the professional on this one. I don't even know.
Okay, but it is wonderful that now we have a field in psychology that deals with how our brain
Mm,
decodes the sound. Because we don't really listen with our ear, but with our brain. It is the brain that decodes the sound. And sound is perception. And perception, by definition, is subjective.
Mm.
wow, that's
So
very
that
true.
explains a lot of things. So, in the 70s and the 80s, there are so many books written by Christian authors. And I would like to be respectful because I think that many of these studies are interesting, but some of they're not fully scientific. They depart from certain bias or prejudice. But
Mhm.
now, if you go to Harvard Institute for Ear and the Brain, for example, you have people specialized in music therapy, psychology of the sound, and they can tell you how the sound affects the brain. And these are totally scientific studies, and they shed a lot of light in how we really listen. And it's very interesting that we listen not only with a section of our brain, which we thought it was the case in the 80s, but we listen not only with our brain, but with our own body. Everything that we are decodes music. It's very interesting because that is what David says in Psalm 103 and
Mhm.
104. Let everything that I am praise God. Right?
Mm. Mm.
So
Absolutely.
there's a lot to explore still, but
I
it's
agree.
very exciting to see how we keep
Mm.
learning.
Hey, I want to get to a few of our comments here from some of our listeners. Bill Omar started us off here on the topic of worship, and he said, worship is an acknowledgement of what we are, a sinner, acknowledgement of our need of God, acknowledgement of who He is.
Amen.
I like that. Marta, she says, music will give different experiences according to our personal lives. I remember once we heard a group who had changed the words of a bolero and made it a sacred song. It surely changed the sanctity of the church service.
Interesting. Wow.
And now we have David Smith. He says, I must love my fellow worshiper enough to be glad when heaven blesses him or her during some musical moment that doesn't particularly bless me, and patient enough to wait 3 minutes for my own favorite to come along.
Oh,
I
wow.
love that comment.
That's good. And Meenakshi, he says, I believe we do have our preferences, and we ought to respect others' preferences as well, as long as music is not disruptive and offensive. After we are all individuals with generational gap and preferences, God loves us all. I think this one comment in the midst of that, as long as music is not disruptive or offensive, I think that's where the conflict emerges, right? This
Yes.
is offensive to me. This isn't offensive to me.
Right. That is part of the struggle, part of the challenge. Um, but I'm struck by just the generosity and the charity of some of the statements here, that people recognize that we may see some of these things differently, and yet we are called upon to be gracious and generous people. I've also been interested we've had the wonderful opportunity at different times to travel in the Holy Land. And when we've been in Israel and have been able to participate in some way, in some kind of celebration that is Jewish, I've been struck by the vibrancy, the energy, the singing, the dancing, and I think, wow, I don't know where I grew up with the idea that worship, for example, in the Old Testament would be quiet and reserved, and because there is a buoyancy to it, a life to it that is really quite compelling. And so it's probably good for us to widen our view some and experience more fully what not only Scripture speaks of, but some of the cultures that grew out of Scripture continue to teach us about worship.
I
Hey,
love what you just said. I'm sorry, Philip.
go ahead.
I love what you just said because you know, one time I took the time to go to the Psalms and count how many times David and the rest of the psalmists mention emotions, and
Wow.
the emotion that is most quoted is joy, and appears 82 times.
Wow.
Joy, and joy, and I just love that. And what Randy mentioned about the culture of worshiping with joy, and I think that we kind of miss that many times, right?
Yeah.
We know how to be solemn, for example. We know how to. We know how to be introspective in worship. We know, but to be joyful,
Right.
that's the challenge for us, right?
Yeah.
And so much, when you look at Judaism, so much of what they do is celebratory in nature. Our land operator and tour guide in travels we've done there is a gentleman named Ezer Kalmovics. And I forget what celebration, Passover, whatever it was that we were talking about. And he said to me one day, he said, Randy, just remember this. Every Jewish ceremony is about this one thing. They tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat.
Wow.
Boil it all down to those three simple things. They tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat. And it kind of captures that celebratory nature of what they're doing when they come before God.
Yeah. That's beautiful. I like what Clinton Hall here said. I've always appreciated the fact that LUC is a place where diversity is valued. And this is one of the reasons that this community has been able to create such spiritually rich and heart-connecting worship experiences.
Wow, Clinton, that's a beautiful and a generous statement. That means so much to those of us who pastor here. Following that, Philip, I'll quote something our organist, Chemo Smith, said to me very early in my tenure here. This is probably something I've quoted more than most things I've been told during my time at Loma Linda. But Chemo's been around the block 2 or 3 times. He's been here as our organist for 40 years. So he knows Loma Linda probably as well as anybody does. And we were talking about these very things, what Clinton has said here and just about the styles and forms of worship and all the rest. And Chemo said to me, Randy, Loma Linda University Church is amazingly tolerant of different styles of music. What it is not tolerant of is mediocrity. And, that stayed with me. And I've appreciated that over the years because of the fact that it says, in whatever manner we are coming before God, let it be with the excellence of our hearts, with the very best that we have to offer. We don't want our very best to be somewhere else for someone else. We want our very best to happen in the context of a service that worships and that honors God. So I've appreciated that very much over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, and now let's jump to a different aspect of worship in a community. And this one is more in terms of the fact of how we do this socially. So what gives both of you hope in an imperfect worshiping community? And what I mean by this is when we as believers don't live out Jesus' love towards one another and end up hurting each other. I mean, what hope is there in a community that's so broken like that? That would hurt one another?
Wow. Yeah, you know, it's a sad reality, but it's the best we've got. In a fractured world, we have broken people. And I think one of the lessons I've been trying to learn, I'm very slow to learn it, but I certainly hope to learn it one day, is that most of the time, most people are doing the best they can.
Yeah.
They're not evil. They're not out to get me. They're not out to get you. They're not out to destroy. I mean, does that exist? Of course it exists. We're in a sinful world. But I think, honestly, particularly when you come to a worshiping community, most of the time people are doing the best they can. And some of the hardest edges, some of the things that hurt others the most, were put into those people's lives by people who hurt them. And they somehow haven't gotten quite resolved, and so they're still sticking out, and they're still hurting other people. But we're all in this together. We're all in it together. We're coming to God to worship Him, to ask Him to somehow change us, form us, transform us. And we just pray that when we do hurt others, we'll do our very best to make it right. We'll learn and we'll grow together and we'll lean on each other, and never forget that we are all desperately in need of God's grace.
Amen. Amen. What are you thinking, Adriana, when you think about imperfect worshiping communities that end up hurting one another along the way?
Yeah, I think that understanding that we are all broken is very important. You know, why is it that Jesus said, wherever the gospel is preached, what this woman has done, will be told? Well, she was so broken, she had nothing to lose. You know what I mean? She had no more reputation to lose or to hold on to. And she knew that without Jesus, she was not interested in a life without him. So she was broken enough to worship him in a very unconventional way. And I realized, some years ago, worship in a church full of people that were so fervent, and they didn't care if I was watching them or not. I realized that in that very moment, that clicked in my mind. They were just worshiping in freedom with total disinhibition. And then I realized that I never had that experience before. I'm always very aware of, what the congregation was, if I do this or I do that, and I had to be in tune with the congregation, which is good. For a worship leader, you have to do that. But sometimes our culture of worship prevents us from freedom when it comes to worshiping God, just as we are, He knows. And something that I would like to say is, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago that
Adriana, somehow we lost you there. You got muted. I'm not sure how that.
You muted yourself accidentally. In the midst of that, I'll say this comment that Synth Pickney brought up. She kind of really hit what Adriana was getting at. And she says, I like that the person in Israel said that to you, Pastor Andy. Can anyone then imagine what African Americans feel and want to do when they come to worship?
Wow.
The Middle Passage, slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, marginalization, racial injustice, etc., etc. We cannot help our bodily movements and loud singing. We're just happy and want to give God praise.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah.
Wow, that brings tears to my eyes just thinking about, pardon me, people who have that experience and now are coming before God in worship and just want to to let all of that gratitude and praise flow out of it. Boy, I wish Adriana wasn't muted, because I wanted her to share something that grows out of Sint's comment here. Maybe if we can get that issue resolved. I heard her say something recently that would be very germane to what Sint said. But yeah, you know, what I think of when I read something like that, Philip, is, pardon me, there are certain moments where you cannot contain the emotion in you, even if you wanted to. I think, for example, of the father when he sees his prodigal son staggering down the lane toward home. The Bible says he ran to meet him. He couldn't contain the emotion. It was so powerful. He was so joyful that his son was coming home. That inner experience came out, and then he just acted on that. And I think of that in terms of Sint's comment. Yeah, absolutely, that makes sense. Happy and want to give God praise. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you. Adriana, I wish you would share. You worked for 10 or 11 years at Oakwood University, which is a historically Black university in the southern part of our country, southeastern part of our country. And I heard you say something recently about how positively worshiping at the Oakwood University Church affected you. Can you share that?
Sure. I mean, thank you for the opportunity to share, because it really changed my life. It was before and after the Oakwood experience. You know, we will come from Spain, and I love how Spaniards worship, but we come very much from a tradition of being very mindful of what people feel and think when you are worshiping. That is just who we are. And then when we went to Oakwood, the first Saturday, you have more than 2,000 people singing as if it were the last time they do it. And
Wow.
That's a principle that they have. For many of them, they want to worship God as if it were the last time.
Wow.
And I love that. And then when you mentioned that for Jewish people, you know, when they celebrate, they are celebrating freedom every time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with the African American experience. And it's very interesting, because when you go to neurospirituals and how they refer to Moses and, you know, the deliverance of Israel, and they make that parallel with their own experience, and that is very present. And it's always very present there. And I was referring to them when I said before, when they were worshiping, and I realized that they didn't care if I was looking or not. They were just so free in God's presence that when they worship, they are reaffirming that they are children of God. Give me Jesus. You can take all this world. You already have taken so much, but I don't like what you have done, but I like your God. I like Jesus. So give me Jesus. You know, it has a whole different meaning when you experience that from people that understands Jesus as their freedom. Freedom means a person has a proper name, and it's Jesus. So it kind of, you know, I am still very rigid when I worship, but once you worship with them for, I don't know, 4, 5, 11 years, you are not the same. You are transformed, and you understand how worship should be transformative. You know, because coming boldly unto God's presence, that has an impact in how you react, how your body, your mind reacts, and that's so beautiful.
Beautiful. Wow. Thank you.
I want to ask you both this question. I think this is a good one that Ed brings up here. He says, what is the role of pastoral leadership or musical ministers in educating or creating awareness regarding the richness of worship experiences and the expressions for the membership? In an era of increasing recognition of how majority culture can impose their will on others, how does the church intentionally communicate a message of inclusion for all?
Wow, that's a great question.
Yeah.
I think one way we do it is that we include different times in worship, especially over the long span of the life of a worshiping community, in which different kinds of worship forms and styles are in evidence. There's always going to be a predominant style that any individual congregation has, and that's good. But maybe there are different times when different ways of worshiping and different songs and different offerings can be included that will continue to expose people to other ways in which people worship God and can communicate the worldwide nature of the people of God. Maybe that's one possibility.
Adriana, what do you think? Your thought on that?
Yeah, I agree with Randy. I think that we can be more intentional in understanding that the hymns that we have been singing, some of them represent more than just music, to some other cultures. And just let me give you an example. One hymn that we have in our hymnal book is "Glorious Things of the Earth Spoken." It's a beautiful hymn written by Joseph Haydn. It happens to be also the Austrian national anthem. So if I am a Seventh-day Adventist in Israel, I doubt I would like to sing that when I worship, because it has a connotation, it has an association. And there are hymns that they have a beautiful story, but they have some cultural associations that if we are not aware of them, we see them as the best we can offer to God. But some other cultures, they have some other approaches to those melodies and messages, right? So I think that it would be good for us to understand that our hymnal book is a beautiful compilation of melodies, but it's not a biblical canon. It's not something that it shouldn't be revised or it shouldn't be complemented by some other contemporary, more inclusive canon, I would say. And I would like to say that as a movement, Adventism was very inclusive of some other genres of music when they started. Ellen G. White was all for that, so was James and many others. So that was not foreign to our movement. So we have to keep it alive. We have to keep growing and expanding and embracing.
Very good. I appreciate that, Adriana, very much.
Thank you for both of you for spending this time with me today, and our viewers. What a blessing it has been. I know that there's more questions that people have that we could go through. Randy, there was a portion of your sermon that people also, I know, were very encouraged when you discussed the idea of hope. And so some people might be wondering, what do they do to kind of build up that hope still in their life? If you had a last comment to kind of share about that, what might you say to those thinking of maybe being a little discouraged about hope in the midst of this time and kind of feeling hopeless about their communities of worship that they're around? What would you say?
Well, I would say one of the really important things is I think the context in which that was written in Hebrews is a context that is emphasizing community and gathering for worship. So we're in a time right now that's tough because there's physical distancing. So I would encourage people who maybe struggle with hope to do what you can to rub shoulders metaphorically with other people, just like what we're doing right now. Taking time to talk together, to listen to each other, to hear the perspectives of others, to hear the hope that other people speak of in their own life and experience can be an encouragement to us, creating a greater hope in our lives. So even though we're going through a tough time right now, I'm going to use the words of Hebrew, don't start isolating. Don't stop gathering, even if it's in this way right now.
Yeah.
This will pass. We will be back together again. But in the meantime, let's not let the circumstances cut us off from each other.
Yeah.
Let your hope inspire hope in me, and maybe my hope can inspire it in you, and we'll all be strengthened.
Amen. Thank you for that. Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Adriana. Appreciate you both so much. And thank you for viewing in and checking in with us. We hope to see you again here, same time, same place, next Saturday afternoon.